I'd like to introduce Nicola Henry, who's an Associate Professor and Vice-Chancellor's Principal Research Fellow in the Centre for Global Research at RMIT University in Melbourne, where she's recently moved after working at La Trobe University. Her research focuses on the prevalence, nature and impacts of gendered violence, including legal and non-legal responses to addressing and preventing violence. And she's one of the leading researchers internationally in the field of technology-facilitated sexual violence and image-based sexual abuse. Nicola is the lead chief investigator of an Australian Research Council discovery project on image-based sexual abuse in Australia, New Zealand and the UK, and lead chief investigator of a Criminology Research Council project on image-based sexual abuse in Australia. As part of her visit here, she's interviewing people who've had experiences of image-based sexual abuse and some key informants. And I'm really pleased I'm in the lucky position of collaborating in a small way in that project. Nicola has published widely in these areas with several books, her most recent ones including Preventing Sexual Violence, Interdisciplinary Approaches to Overcoming Rape Culture, in 2014 with Palgrave Macmillan, Rape Justice Beyond the Criminal Law, in 2015 with Palgrave Macmillan, and Sexual Violence in a Digital Age, which is out this year, and really fantastic body of work. So welcome, Nicola, and thank you very much.
Thanks everybody for coming today, and thank you so much to Nicola for generously hosting me here at Auckland University and for inviting me to this great symposium today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders both past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge victims, survivors of sexual and domestic violence for the injustices that have been perpetrated against them, but also for their resilience and their strength and the inspiration that they give so many of us here today in the work that we do. Some of the content of my presentation is obviously difficult content. I, with horror, realised that I hadn't included a slide at the end with a list of support services for people in the audience who might find some of the material distressing, but I am happy for if anyone wants that information to give that to you at the end, and Nicola, if I forget which services, New Zealand services are available, then Nicola's here as well, who will be able to help in that matter. So there's been a lot of attention in recent times to the range of criminal and unlawful behaviours that are perpetrated with the aid of digital technologies. But much of this focus has been on the high-tech computer crimes like computer hacking, online fraud, identity theft, but also child exploitation material and cyberbullying. Less attention, although this is changing, as Nicola pointed out, less attention has been paid to what we call technology-facilitated sexual violence. And this is where new technologies are used to perpetrate or to continue the harms of sexual violence, sexual harassment, and domestic or family violence. So we use the term, this is my colleague and I, Dr. Anastasia Powell, also from RMIT University, we use the term technology-facilitated sexual violence, which I know is not a great term because it's a bit of a mouthful, but we use that term really as an umbrella concept to capture a range of abusive behaviours that exist on a continuum of gendered violence, and it basically includes three key categories. One is technology-enabled sexual aggression. I'll explain this very shortly. The second is image-based sexual abuse, which is what the majority of my presentation today will be focused on. And the third one is online sexual harassment. Now, there are so many different ways to classify and categorise these different forms of technology abuse and harassment. This is just one way, and I know that there are problems, with creating categories, but I love to be organised and I love categories, so just bear with me on that one. So let me just explain, I really this is kind of like an overview of our model of technology-facilitated sexual violence with those three kind of overarching categories. So the first one, if we can just focus on that for a second, is technology-enabled sexual aggression. So what we mean by that, we've got a number of subcategories. So the first is the harassment of rape victims. Now, some of you will be familiar with the case of Audrey Pott, who was a Californian 15-year-old teenage girl who was sexually assaulted while she was incapacitated at a student party. The sexual assaults were recorded and distributed to her peers. She was then subjected to harassment and humiliation as the photos of the sexual assault went viral, leading her to take her own life 8 days later. So that would be an example of technology-enabled sexual aggression that we are interested in. And this also happened to Canadian girl Retta Parsons, who was also sexually assaulted. The sexual assaults were also filmed. She also suffered horrendous online abuse and harassment, which also led to her taking her own life. And they're just two examples. There's many more of where image-based abuse and harassment of sexual assault and rape victims has led to this terrible outcome. The second thing is the facilitation of a sexual offence. This basically refers to the use of an internet site or a mobile phone app that's used to set up a sexual assault in person. So they may meet online, and then later on the victim is sexually assaulted. And there are also, many of you may have heard of situations where there's an online classified or a trading site that the perpetrator uses to advertise that his partner or his ex-partner is available for rough sex. And this is sometimes called rape by proxy. Another form of technology enabled sexual aggression concerns simulated sexual violence, also known as virtual or cyber rape. And this basically refers to when a person's avatar or their digital representation of themselves is subjected to some kind of form of simulated sexual violence. And then we have the pro-rape groups on the internet. So, for instance, where non-consensual images of female students, such as upskirting and downblousing images, are hosted in these online pro-rape groups. The commentary and the rating of how rapeable certain female students are out of 1 to 10. But also comments identifying the classes or dorm rooms of female students, and jokes about rape generally, including commentary regarding specific incidences of sexual assault on campus. The second category is online sexual harassment, which we include sexual solicitation, rape threats, online rape threats, image-based harassment, gender-based hate speech. Sexual solicitation basically refers to someone being like other forms of sexual harassment where there's repeated requests for sex in an online context. Online rape threats are what it indicates here is someone being threatened with rape and sexual violence. Image-based harassment, we use this term distinctly from image-based sexual abuse, although I know there are overlaps, and I think Brandy is speaking about dick pics today, is that right? Yeah, so we include the receiving unsolicited intimate or sexual nude images in our definition of image-based harassment, which some people might call cyber flashing. And then finally, gender-based hate speech, which Nicola referred to at the beginning. Now, I am going to be focusing on image-based sexual abuse the rest of the presentation, but I just wanted to kind of give you an overview, I guess, of the work that I've been doing in this particular space, and really to think about where the overlaps happen within these particular categories. So, unfortunately, a lot of these behaviours are incredibly prevalent. So just to give you an idea of a study that we did in 2015 of over 5,000 Australian and UK respondents, we had the following key findings. I'll just go through these really quickly. Nearly 12% of respondents, and I'm just focusing on Australian women here rather than UK women or Australian men and UK men. But in terms of Australian women's experiences of technology-facilitated sexual violence, nearly 12% received a described or a visual representation of an unwanted sexual act. 1 in 10 had an unwanted sexual experience with someone they first met online. 9% had received comments, emails or text messages threatening sexual assault. 7.5% said someone had posted their personal details online saying they were available for sex. 9.1% said that someone had taken a nude or a semi-nude image without their permission. 8.1% said someone had threatened to post nude or semi-nude images of them, and 7.4% said that someone had in fact posted nude or semi-nude images online. The most common form of online sexual harassment in our 2015 study, was receiving unwanted sexually explicit images, comments, emails or text message, and receiving repeated and or unwanted sexual requests online and via email or text message. So in our study, 21.6% experienced the repeated or unwanted sexual requests. So quite a high number, but if you just focus on the younger group of women, it's incredibly high. So I think it's something like 1 in actually, don't quote me on that one, I've forgotten what the stat is, but for all of those different categories that I've just outlined, the highest kind of rate of victimisation is among younger women. But then we also had other common experiences. So nearly 20% experienced gender-based hate speech online, over 10% received sexuality or sexual identity-based offensive or degrading messages, comments or content online, and 9% received comments, emails or texts threatening rape or a sexual assault. So because we could have done a further study on any of those different behaviours, and we hopefully will continue to do this work because there's so much work to be done in this area. But what we decided to do was actually to apply for some funding to do further research into image-based sexual abuse, because we did find that 1 in 10 of our respondents in that 2015 survey had said that someone that experienced someone distributing nude or semi-nude images of them without their permission. So we really wanted to explore further. So I guess we kind of just to start with I should probably explain. So the methodology from the criminology research grant that Nicola mentioned in the introduction, we have conducted a national survey in Australia with 4,274 participants aged between 16 and 49. We've also done interviews with 52 participants across Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia. So we've interviewed police, we've interviewed legal and policy experts, domestic and sexual violence support advocates, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer representatives, but also people from the youth sector, academics, industry representatives, and also disability support representatives. And as Nicola mentioned at the beginning as well, we are doing another big study, and this time it's cross-jurisdictional, looking at New Zealand, the UK and Australia, redoing our national survey in all those 3 country contexts just to see, what the difference is in terms of prevalence, but also interviewing victims, and Nicola and I have been doing those interviews this week and last week, and also interviewing key informants or key stakeholders. Okay, so moving on to revenge porn or image-based abuse. Most of you have probably heard of the term revenge porn. Really, it's a media-generated term that's widely understood to include the non-consensual distribution or sharing of nude or sexual images, typically after a relationship is broken down via mobile phone or the internet. Now, this term has been incredibly helpful on the one hand in terms of raising attention to this issue, because it's a somewhat salacious term. It's a bit catchier than a term like the non-consensual sharing of intimate images or image-based sexual abuse. But nonetheless, there are a good number of reasons for why we should reject this term. So first of all, the term doesn't capture the different range of motivations beyond that of revenge. So for instance, when someone is sharing nude or sexual images as a way to impress their peers in an online context, where they have no motivation of revenge, that they're doing it for social status, building motivations. The other problem is that with revenge porn, because it focuses exclusively on the non-consensual sharing of intimate images, it doesn't capture the range of other ways in which image-based abuse is actually happening. So for instance, someone's secretly taking nude or sexual images, so secret recordings, or someone threatening to share those images online or via mobile phone or through some other method. So it's kind of narrow, it's a misnomer because it doesn't, it captures way more than the revenge. But then the other thing too is it implies that the images are pornography, or that they serve the purposes of pornography, and that could be very offensive for many victims of image-based abuse. So there are victim-blaming connotations. It implies with the term revenge and porn that the victim's done something to attract the ire of the perpetrator. The focus then with the term revenge porn is on the content of the image, but what we argue is that it should be on the abusive actions of perpetrators in disrespecting consent and going out and taking images without consent, or sharing those images without consent, or threatening to share those images without consent. So image-based abuse or image-based sexual abuse, we argue, captures much broader and more complex array of behaviours and motivations. So there are the three key behaviours: the non-consensual taking or creation of intimate images, the non-consensual sharing or distribution, and making threats is the third one. So it's important just to note that that image-based abuse or image-based sexual abuse is very complex. It takes place in the context of domestic violence, sexual violence among intimate partners or ex-partners, but also among work colleagues, family members, and strangers in both public and private places. So it includes scenarios like where a sexual assault or a rape has been photographed or filmed, where an abusive partner or ex-partner is threatening to distribute nude or sexual images in order to prevent the victim from leaving the relationship, from pursuing an intervention order, or as another form of abuse and control in a domestic violence relationship. It includes when computer hackers are able to get access to a victim's webcam and their personal computer files. It includes online dating scams where a victim shares intimate images with a stranger who then threatens to share those images unless they perform a sex act for them, unless they meet up with them in person, unless they pay money, or unless they share further images. But it also includes other acts such as upskirting and downblousing, which are also really problematic terms, but you probably can gather what they mean, so they're useful in that regard, which, and other acts of secretly recording consensual sexual activity, as well as those more standard cases where there is a revenge element, where the perpetrator is trying to get some kind of retribution for something they perceive that the victim has done in the aftermath of a relationship. But the kind of terminology issues aren't just semantic. Like, there are some real ramifications of the consequences of using the term revenge porn. So I'll just give you an example here. In the UK, the legislation that came into force in 2015 makes the disclosure of a private sexual photograph or film without consent a criminal offence. Now, while this sounds okay, especially compared to Australia, where there are still some jurisdictions that currently don't have specific offences in place, the problem with the UK law is that the prosecution must prove that the perpetrator intended to cause distress or harm. That means that in the UK, that it doesn't include the threat to share nude or sexual images. It doesn't capture persons who lack that specific intent to cause harm or distress. So that means that if a person is trading in non-consensual imagery, because they are doing that online, if they're trading in those images in secret online community groups and on other online platforms, they can't be prosecuted under the UK legislation. And I'm going to talk a little bit in a moment about the New Zealand criminal offence under the Harmful Digital Communications legislation, which also has a requirement that the perpetrator must have intended to cause distress or harm. So I'm going to show how that is really limiting. And I think it does. I think part of the problem is that everyone's been so focused on this idea of revenge porn that the legislation has been shaped according to kind of really narrow conceptualisations of what that actually means. So just to give you a few examples from the quotes, some quotes from some interviews that we conducted with key stakeholders who were reflecting on the nature of image-based abuse, the different examples. So I'll just read these out. This is from Robert, who's from police. There were 4 flatmates, 1 male and 3 females, and the male had set up cameras around the house to video the girls either getting changed, coming out of showers, all that kind of stuff. He got caught out when he left something on his computer screen that one of them noticed, and one of them made a complaint, and then they found all this footage that he'd been keeping of all the girls. And another one from Esther, who was a victim support advocate, I think in disability. A supervisor at work was, this example was of someone who's got a disability. A supervisor at work was taking photos of her on his mobile phone of him touching her breasts, and she wasn't sure, but she thought that he also took a photo of her vagina as well. She said repeatedly that she wanted him to stop and that she was really afraid that he would put the photos on Facebook. So these are examples of the first category of the non-consensual taking or creation of nude or sexual images. A couple of other ones from Christine. She's been approached in public. She thinks her ex has posted something in a closed group inciting a range of men to find her and rape her. She's been approached at the beach with men with cameras being filmed on the beach, and she's had to flee. And another one from Ashley, another victim support advocate. She was at work in the sex industry and she was assaulted by a group of men, and that was posted on a dominant sort of online forum where a lot of people were able to see it, and she was just devastated. And finally, in relation to the threats to those other examples that I just showed were of sharing nude or sexual images. This one here is of making threats to share images. So from Michelle, who was a legal expert in our study, the threat of having that image disseminated amongst work and family and friends is usually the way to keep somebody within an abusive relationship. And Denise, also a domestic violence support advocate, he'd captured their sexual life on DVDs and photographs. He was using threats to distribute revenge porn as a way of maintaining control over her. So just to get into the most recent survey, just to give you some figures of findings around prevalence and impacts of image-based sexual abuse in the Australian context. We did a survey late last year and we're kind of presenting our findings in various fora. This year we haven't yet, our article on this hasn't yet been published, but I'm happy to share the report. It's available online if you're interested. So what we did is we were interested in the extent, the nature, and the impacts of image-based sexual abuse among young people and adults, so aged between 16 and 49. The survey was with over 4,000 Australian respondents. Overall we found that 1 in 5 had experienced at least one form of image-based sexual abuse. So the non-consensual taking or creation of nude or sexual images, or the non-consensual distribution or sharing, or thirdly, someone had threatened to share intimate images of them. So breaking that down a little bit further, 1 in 5 had had an image taken of them without their consent, 1 in 10 had had an image distributed without their consent, 1 in 10 had had images threatened. And we asked the female respondents in our survey about downblousing and upskirting. We found that 1 in 10 had said that they'd experienced downblousing, and 1 in 20 had experienced upskirting. Now, unfortunately, these rates are likely to be an underestimate. And the reason for that is because our respondents could only report on where they knew that someone had taken images of them or where they'd shared those images. So unfortunately, we don't really know the true prevalence of image-based sexual abuse. And in terms of like the gendered, the rates of victimisation and perpetration around gender, obviously that's something we're really interested in. This table is in relation to Victoria, which is the state in which I live in Australia. It just gives you an idea about victimisation. So these figures here refer to the numbers of victims, the raw numbers. So, for instance, relating to upskirting, I don't know how even there could be any numbers in relation to men, actually. We have to ask the Crime Statistics Agency about that. I've just suddenly realised. But really small numbers of victims that had reported upskirting, and in part that might be because they don't always know that someone is taking images of them in a public place up their skirt. In terms of what you can see here is in terms of those who've had an image sent without their consent, obviously the majority here, according to these statistics, is of women. So age 0 to 17 years, 37 female, 4 male. And then when you start to look beyond 18, again, you have way more females than males reporting that experience. And then when you look at the threats to send images, you have, again, a kind of quite a clear gendered pattern. But I do need to mention that in our survey, we did find quite similar rates of image-based abuse amongst men and women. And that may be a surprise. It probably wasn't to us, because in our previous survey, we'd found a similar thing, and we had to kind of think about the way in which our questions were phrased. Because in our previous 2015 survey, I think that I'm just trying to remember, there was something that's very kind of complex, but there was something, the way in which we'd asked whether someone had taken a topless image, and we wondered whether, some men had said, a topless image of them had been taken without their consent, and that kind of skewed the results. But we also did another survey, a national survey, very recently with the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia, and we did actually find more of a gendered pattern. We found more women than men had experienced all forms of image-based abuse. But I think the important thing here is that surveys are really, really useful, and governments and policymakers and lawyers absolutely love the figures. It's been really useful for us to do this research and to see that politicians have actually acted on, this is a growing concern, introducing specific criminal offences and drawing on the data that we've produced. So it's really powerful, but it's not the only way in which we need to construct our knowledge around this issue. We really need to make sure that we do the mixed methods research, not just the quantitative studies, but also look at the qualitative data. And when you look, obviously when you look at criminal justice statistics about how many people are reporting, you're not going to get a very good number around prevalence, but you can get some kind of idea about the pattern of people who are reporting. But then also, if you look, like I've also been engaged in online ethnographic research, also with the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia, where I've actually gone onto these websites, onto porn sites. We've gone onto the dark web. We've gone onto online community forums as much as we can on Facebook pages and those types of things. Obviously, this research is also limited because we can't get into people's mobile phones, and we can't hack into people's private Facebook pages, although we'd probably quite like to. And the dark web raises all sorts of issues around what we can and can't see, because a lot of these groups in the dark web require, special membership, and I don't even know what you need to do, but I'm sure it's pretty dark. So when you go and, if you're interested and I can tell you it's horrible research to have to do, is to going and looking at these porn websites and looking at ex-girlfriend websites that are specifically set up for people to share images and to share details about the victims depicted in those images. It's really quite clear that this is a gendered phenomenon. So, and that what I mean by that is that mostly women are the subject of that non-consensual sharing online, but not exclusively. There were gay male sites where images were being shared without consent, and I'm also aware of some mobile phone apps where people like Grindr, for instance, where I've heard about a lot of image-based abuse happening on some of those kind of apps as well. So image-based abuse was reported among vulnerable Australians in our study. So just really quickly, 1 in 2 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people reported experiencing at least one form of image-based abuse, keeping in mind the numbers are very, very small. 1 in 2 respondents with a disability. 1 in 3 lesbian, gay and bisexual respondents. We weren't able to report on transgender or intersex because our numbers are very small. 1 in 3 young people aged between 16 and 19, 1 in 4 aged between 20 and 29, and also 1 in 2 who had experienced pressure or coercion to send sexual self-images also reported higher rates of image-based sexual abuse. And we're trying to do the lot. We're trying to do everything in our study. We also ask questions about perpetration. And I'll just go through this really quickly because I know I'm running out of time. But 1 in 10 of our respondents disclosed having engaged in at least one form of image-based abuse. So nearly 9% had said they'd taken a nude or sexual image without a person's permission. Nearly 7% said they'd shared those images without permission, and 1 in 20 had said they'd threatened someone with distributing those images. Now, obviously, this is self-reporting, but they roughly match up with our victimisation results, I think. Now, also around gender is that more men than women reported image-based abuse perpetration. The perpetration was highest amongst males aged between 20 and 29, and those males aged 30 to 39. It's probably not a surprise. It's not a surprise to me. And perpetration was highest for women aged between 20 and 29 and 16 to 19, which again doesn't really surprise me very much. The distribution for perpetrators in our study, the victim was most likely to be a partner or a former partner, or next to family member and then next to friend. So that just gives us a bit of another idea about kind of what's happening in this particular area. In terms of psychological impacts, we found that those victims who reported someone threatening to share images had the highest report of depression, anxiety, according to our study. So 80% said that they experienced extreme depression and anxiety. 67% who had someone take an image without their consent, and then 75% who'd had someone share images without consent said that they had moderate to severe depression, anxiety. Sorry, they didn't actually say that they had moderate to severe anxiety or depression. We actually used a scale and got a Kessler, forgotten the rest of it, you probably know it, the Kessler scale, where people, respond to a set of behavioural questions, and then we're able to kind of test to what extent they had those symptoms. Approximately a third of those who reported experience image-based abuse felt very or extremely fearful for their safety, and women who experienced image-based abuse were more likely than the men in our survey to report feeling afraid for their safety. So just have I got about 45 minutes in total, haven't I, Nicola? Yeah, okay, till 2. Okay. So I have got my little timer on here because I'm not always good at keeping the time. So I'm just going to talk briefly about criminal offences in New Zealand and then move on to talking about some of the other ways in which we can respond to image-based abuse. As many of you will know, more than me, I'm sure, about the New Zealand legislation in 2015, the Harmful Digital Communications Act came into effect, making it a criminal offence I'll start with. The aim of the legislation was to deter, prevent and mitigate the harm caused by individuals to digital communications and to provide victims with a quick and efficient means of redress. So in terms of the criminal offence that's contained in that legislation, because it's a mixture of criminal and civil, it is a criminal offence under that legislation to post digital communications with the intention to cause harm to a victim. But then that's the first requirement. So there's got to be a perpetrator has to intend to cause harm or distress. As I pointed out, that's really problematic. But then the second part is that there's an objective test that's kind of embedded in this section 22 of the legislation, which is that it would cause harm to a reasonable person in the position of the victim. And the third thing is that it does in fact cause harm. So harm is defined as serious emotional distress in the legislation. And there have been some cases that have been tested in New Zealand courts. There was one recently that went to the High Court of New Zealand, and it was found that she hadn't experienced serious emotional distress, and it's quite complicated, the reasons why. But this is, you can see, you know, with these particular provisions, it's really problematic. Now, there's a maximum sentence of 2 years or a $50,000 fine. One of the issues I think around why the requirement around intention and the requirement about proof of serious emotional distress, why that's contained in the legislation is partly because it's a broad act. So it also encompasses cyberbullying and other forms of harmful digital communications. Now, had New Zealand introduced a specific criminal offence, it may have been able to bypass some of those really problematic requirements around intention and serious emotional distress. So maybe we can all push for some change down the track. There's all sorts of arguments for and against, you know, why a specific criminal offence would be desirable. I, of course, being a sexual violence researcher, would like to see a specific offence. It's really interesting because so far there's been 55 convictions between 2015 and 2017 under the New Zealand legislation. Remember, it's for all those broad set of behaviours, but what is actually happening is that the majority of those 55 convictions have been for image-based abuse behaviours. So I think that that's indicative of why a specific criminal offence would be desirable. Now, of course, the criminal law is a limited avenue from which to seek redress for image-based abuse behaviours. And we have asked our stakeholders about some of the reporting barriers, reporting to police and going down the criminal justice pathway. And I'll just go through a couple of quotes really quickly. Donna, support, said, if you get a response to the desk that there's nothing we can do about that, you just have to wander off, don't you? Because you can't, because what can you do? The police have told you they can't do anything. And from Jackie, the comment that the contact offences will be always of a higher priority than non-contact offences is a widespread attitude among many police that I've encountered. I think it's a deeply problematic one, and it reflects a failure to understand the nature of the harm that is caused by image-based abuse offences. Mackie, academic, you have a fairly high confidence that, say, people who might work in child exploitation sections are not sharing around images of child porn, because everybody acknowledges that that's abhorrent. Whereas images of naked or semi-naked women, you know, I can imagine guys thinking that's a nice part of their job. And Lisa from support, sometimes it's about police response, a lot of the time it's about this isn't serious enough. We're taught to denigrate the experiences we have and to undersell them, and our friends are as well. You know, he didn't hit you, he was just having a bad day, it didn't get physical, so what can you report? Unfortunately, some of those victim-blaming attitudes are held by police, sometimes where they say to the victim that just to turn off their mobile phones, to deactivate their Facebook page. Police don't know how Facebook works and other kind of social media sites. But we, either do I actually with Facebook, I have to be honest. I used to be on Facebook. Actually, I think I've gone back on, but I deactivated my account a long time ago. So what we also found in our survey is that unfortunately there were a lot of victim-blaming beliefs and attitudes that were held by members of the community. So 70% in our study agreed with the statement that a person should know better than to take nude or sexual images in the first place. 62% agreed that if a person sends a nude or sexual image to someone else, then they're at least partly responsible if the image ends up online. And these attitudes were held by 1 in 2 men, 1 in 3 women, 71.3% of the perpetrators in the study of male perpetrators, and 57.9% of female perpetrators in the study. So there are a lot of challenges around the criminal justice system. It is there's arguably around whether or not it serves a deterrent effect. That's always an argument amongst criminal lawyers about whether the law can kind of serve that purpose. The criminal law does play a symbolic role, so I think it is important to have those offences in place, but we need to have a suite of justice options for victims of image-based sexual abuse. So just really quickly in the last kind of minute or two, I'm going to talk about some of the other avenues, and I'll talk a little bit about what the social media and technology companies are doing. So the first is there are civil remedies available both in New Zealand and in Australia and elsewhere. So for instance, copyright. If you're the owner of the image, you can actually sue the perpetrator in court for breach of copyright. But sometimes it's the person who's taken the image of you. So obviously that's got limited applicability. There was a successful case in Australia where the victim received $50,000 in damages after her ex-partner posted nude images of her on Facebook, and that was he was sued under breach of confidence in Australia. Now, the problem with civil remedies is that some victims don't want to go down that pathway in the same way they don't want to go down the criminal justice pathway. They don't want to report to police for all sorts of reasons. But there's also, you need money and you need resources and you need to know how the system works. So it's just really not a great option. It is an option for some people, and we have seen some cases there. In New Zealand, the Harmful Digital Communications Act empowers NetSafe to resolve complaints on behalf of the victims. So a victim can call up, they can go onto the website and they can make a complaint about their experience of image-based abuse. And NetSafe can attempt to resolve that complaint by contacting the person who's sharing or threatening to share those images, and asking them to remove those images and to take quick and efficient action. Now, the other thing too about the New Zealand legislation is that it does empower the New Zealand District Court to issue takedown orders and to impose penalties on those who don't comply. And this is where NetSafe is unable to resolve the complaint. Now, the problem with the New Zealand District Court avenue is that while it's technically free, so it's free to file an application in the New Zealand District Court, it is advisable to get legal representation, and this is particularly the case if the perpetrator, or it could be a social media company, have top-notch lawyers and you're a victim of image-based abuse. Not having legal representation to help you navigate the complicated district court process could be very harrowing. The other thing too is very time-consuming, so it doesn't fulfil the aim of resolving this issue in a timely and efficient manner. Just a mention about Australia, I'm not really allowed to talk about this, so I'll be very brief, but I just received the exposure draft bill for a civil penalties scheme that I was meant to have comments back by this morning at 9 a.m. It didn't happen, because they basically gave us a couple of days to actually have a look at that legislation. But different kind of scheme to New Zealand, to the New Zealand District Court and the NetSafe powers, but essentially there are financial penalties for someone who fails to comply with orders under the proposed civil penalty scheme. Basically, it'll be administered by the Office of the E-Safety Commissioner, in some ways, similar ways to what's happening here in New Zealand. And then we have this really interesting and quite controversial Facebook and the Australian E-Safety Office pilot trial. Okay, so basically what this is that it's through Facebook. If you are worried that someone is going to share an image of you, so they haven't done so yet, you're worried that they're going to, what you can do is you can send an image to yourself via Messenger. You contact the E-Safety Office and then they liaise with Facebook, with the online content team at Facebook, basically to get that image to create a hash or what's called a digital fingerprint, and then if that image is ever shared on Facebook or its subsidiaries, that it'll be immediately blocked because it'll make a match with the image that you uploaded. Now, it's great that these companies are taking proactive steps to try and address this issue, but there are some real risks associated there around, what happens if the perpetrator alters the image? Is it able to make a match? I'm not quite sure about that. And also, what happens if you're underage and you're sending images to yourself? In Australia, there are a number of jurisdictions where that's actually a criminal offence. And also, who gets to see these images before the hash is created? So there are some issues there. And then, of course, there are a whole range of other measures that are being taken by social media companies and technology companies. For instance, some of the porn sites even have policies and practices. You might be surprised. Pornhub used to have porn all over its reporting page, but they've kindly removed the images, which is, I know it's a problematic site, but, there are some things that are happening. There's a reporting page, and apparently Pornhub has actually been quite good in removing images when a report has been made. And even the ex-girlfriend websites, where there's a deliberate invitation to post images of people and to post information about where they live, what their name is, what their age is, what their occupation is, in some cases where they live. Even those websites have policies around this type of thing. But in many cases, it's just a joke, because they're not that interested in removing non-consensual images of adult women. Where they are more interested is to remove images of child exploitation material, because it's more heavily clamped down upon than nude or sexual images of adults. So I've really run over, I had 45 minutes, I've got about 10 seconds. So just to end, we need to improve information and support to those who experience image-based abuse, and to a diversity of people, so people with disabilities, Indigenous people, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex people, young people as well. We need to have community education, awareness and prevention. Obviously, that's really important. It shouldn't be focused on the young girl who shouldn't have taken the images, which a lot of those messages, that's what the message is, rather than on perpetrators and bystanders. We do need better resources for police. They are very overwhelmed in terms of cyber crime investigations. There's no doubt about it. It's incredibly expensive, incredibly time consuming. We do need to improve legal protections. We do need to continue to see action from social media and online platforms and technology companies to improve the action and the policies and the practices around removal of requests. And we do need to have better training for those working with individuals who experience image-based abuse, as well as the criminal justice authorities. Thanks very much.